Here's an example of some code that uses fgets to read strings from the file. This is a complete code example, and I'll post this in the Canvas sections so you can play with it if you like. But we'll walk through it here in this video. First of all, excuse me. First of all, you have to have standard io.h. That's to get the IO functions. I also included string.h, but probably I didn't need that for this example because I'm not actually doing anything with the strings I read from the file except printing them. If you were, you would be, maybe you're stir copying them or doing something with them, you would need string.h as well. I've declared a buffer as a global variable in my program, and I made it hold up to 2,000 characters. I've initialized it to be full of zeros, which is convenient, a convenient means to initialize. You really should always initialize your variables. In the main function, there's a printf to tell us what's going on, and then there's an fopen. Fopen is the function you use in C to associate a file name on your disk drive with a file pointer in your C program. So C doesn't directly manipulate files by name, it manipulates them by pointer, and fopen is what associates the name with the pointer. So I'm telling fopen to open a file called unauthorizedbread.txt for read. That's what the little quote R quote. You can open a file for read, write, append, or some combination. However, we just want to read the file. We don't want to change it. So we're going to open it with read. The file itself is a science fiction story, a contemporary one. It's kind of interesting about the dark side of the IoT. If you want to read it, there's a link to it in the Canvas section. You always need to check that the file opened successfully, because if it didn't, FP, the file pointer, will come back as null. And when you try to use it in subsequent operations, to say read from the file, you'll get your program will crash. Since that crash might be quite a few lines from where the actual problem is, that can be really confusing. So right after you open the file, always check that it opened successfully. And if FP comes back as anything other than null, then the file opened fine. Otherwise, best thing to do is just print a message so you know what happened and exit at that point while you figure out what's going on. Getting past that point, okay, we didn't exit, so we're still going, must have opened okay. We're going to use fgets to read from that file. FP is now associated with the file unauthorizedbread.txt. We're going to read as much of that as we can, as much as buffer will hold, or one line, whichever comes first, into buffer. As a side effect, sort of, C returns a pointer to that buffer. This is mostly useful for figuring out when you've run out of data to read. You have the data in the buffer, you can manipulate it directly in the buffer, but by checking the result pointer, you can figure out whether you actually finished reading the file or not. So when it comes back null, there's no more data to read. So we do an initial read in case the file is 0 length, which happens a lot. And then if it's not, we read something, we go into this while loop, we print what we read, and we read again. So basically this just reads the file line by line and prints it using fgets. At the end, we fclose the file, which is important because it's kind of tidying up. That is very needed when you're writing files, not so much when you're reading them, but it's still good form. So if we were to compile this program and run it, we can see what happens. So I'm going to make the terminal window a little larger, and I'm going to compile this program using a command line because my old version of Visual Studio is kind of broken down, and this is the best way to do it in my environment. Obviously, you can use whatever tools you have. So it's called read demo fgets.c, and I want the output file to be called fgets demo. So that's going to use the GCC, the GNU C compiler, to compile the C code and produce a runnable file, an executable file. On Windows, this would be fgetsdemo.exe that we can play with. Since we got no messages, we're going to assume that it worked correctly. I don't have warnings turned up very high, so there could be sneaky stuff happening in the file that I missed, but there weren't any gross syntax errors. To run the file here in it's basically a bash terminal, as on Linux, although this is a Mac, just type the name of the file, and away we go. Now let's scroll back and see what we read. It's just a short segment. It's a much longer story, but this is a short segment that we're playing with. Notice that each line, some of the lines got line wrapped in my window, but basically every paragraph came out as a line. That's because this is where the line endings are in the original file. It's a common way of writing text is to basically make each sentence or each line a paragraph. So that's exactly, so the file is basically exactly like the input file. We just copied the file the hard way around. So in the next video, we'll talk about using the file-based version of scanf, fscanf, to do some conversion on the file, which will make an interesting result. And then finally, we'll go on and look at fread, which is the binary version that does no conversion, no fancy stuff at all, just basically moves bytes. Remember, fgets does a little bit of work besides just moving bytes. It replaces new lines with nulls, and it cuts off when it gets to the right length to keep the buffer from overflowing. Okay, I'll see you in the next video.